Coming up on today's edition of Locked On Eagles, we take a look at what potential role players fans could be calling for more snaps during the 2022 season for the Eagles. And we also continue our What If series starring Mr. Super Bowl 52 MVP Nick Foles. What if the Eagles ran back the Nick Foles magic, not just after 2017, but after the 2018 run as well? That's coming up on today's edition of Locked On Eagles.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Welcome in, Eagles fans, to a Tuesday edition of the show. I'm Louie DiBiase. He's Gino Camilleri. We've been your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast now going strong for 4 years. You can find us on all podcast platforms in video form as well on YouTube, and hit us up on Twitter at Locked On Birds, at DiBiase LOE, and at GC24_football. Continuing our What If series today with a little Nick Foles magic. But Gino, before we get into that, training camp is only 3 weeks away. I mean, that's completely wild to me, man, right? Football's right around the corner.
21 days, brother.
21 days.
21 days, and the NFL's back. Because once training camp hits, I mean, it's over. The season begins.
Blink of an eye, and suddenly the Senior Bowl's back.
I think I said it a couple weeks ago that I always felt the end of the summer was like July 4th when I was in school, right? Because then you go back to school a couple weeks later there, but it doesn't really feel like a couple weeks. It's actually 8 weeks. And you think about the NFL timeline, just a couple weeks ago, we were doing OTAs and we were saying it's 8 weeks away from training camp. We're 21 days away. And the Philadelphia Eagles, they're in consideration for being a team that is talked about in a very good light this season, which in the past couple of years hasn't been that way. And on paper, they have put together a damn impressive team. Are there still holes? Absolutely. But do they believe that they have the sixth man off the bench? Do they believe that they have the 12th guy to come off of the rotation in this depth chart? I firmly believe.
I like the way you worded that.
As well as, excuse me, as well and as deep as the top is, I think the depth and the rotational men that they could put into the lineup is as good, if not better, than most teams around the NFL. I mean, you're going to look at the top teams, of course, but they're right in the consideration for,
they're deep.
I mean, top to bottom, 1 to 53. They're going to be in top 12 consideration all day long, in my opinion.
Certain positions more than other, they're deep. And Gino, that's what I wanted to get into with you today, because we've been talking about, you see PFF or CBS today actually came out with a list of the most improved teams this offseason. The Eagles were actually number 1 ahead of the Los Angeles Chargers. The Cincinnati Bengals were in there, the New York Jets. So we know the star power they have on both sides of the ball at the top. But as you mentioned, the 6th guy, the 12th guy off the bench, the rotational role players that could maybe even be starters on other teams. Before we get into our What If series, that's what I want to talk to you about with camp coming up too. You're going to be looking deeper into the 53-man roster and talking about guys, what kind of roles can they have outside of just being the wide receiver 1, which we know A.J. Brown's going to be, or Jalen Hurts is a starting quarterback. But when it comes to other roles that players can, sketch out for themselves, Gino, I wanted to get into that with you. Like, what are some of the role players this year that can not only create that position for themselves, but I don't know, I feel like every year there's a guy that's part of a rotation. Maybe he's, 60-40 in snaps, 70-30. They want to develop him. Maybe he's going to be a future starter. Right now, he's just part of, again, like a 3 or 4-man rotation. But again, the efficiency is always there when he's on the field. And eventually, maybe even halfway through the season, fans start to call for that guy to get on the field more. Maybe it's not, at the mercy of the starter because he's playing so bad, but maybe just in general, like, this guy just deserves to be on the field. He's just simply better. I feel like Josh Sweat was kind of that way in 2019 and 2020. As Brandon Graham and Derek Barnett were taking up a lot of those snaps, and even when Vinny Curry came back in 2019, right? And so there's those players every year. Who's a guy like that for you this year that maybe fans and analysts alike will be like, I don't know, 6-8 weeks through the season, he needs to be on the field more?
To look at this in 2 different lights is how I would go about it. I would say, 1, what are the roles that need to be carved out? Right. And then 2, who are the people that would apply to set rules? I would say everybody but quarterback and offensive line. Maybe corner. Probably corner, I would say, is up in there. Linebacker, safety, wide receiver, defensive line, kick returner, even the punter right now, running back. Those are all up in the air. And you have to say, for a role player, what do you look for? I look for good fundamental traits that are probably great, even close to elite in some facets. Like you look at Quez Watkins, for example, right? Somebody who should take on a higher role. I don't want to see Greg Ward getting as many snaps. I don't even want to see Greg Ward on the roster, to be honest with you. I said this last year just because I want to see the youth get up there. Quez Watkins, he is very good to elite in getting down the field, right? He has that burner ability. That is a role that this Eagles team needs. You look at the top 2 wide receivers right now, neither of them are true down the field, go get it guys. They're going to rack up yards in the intermediate areas and get tons of yards after the catch. But if they want a true straight line burner that can also go and get it in the 50-50 areas, who's only going to be more efficient with the players around them, be a true Danny Green, I think Quez Watkins is 1A, 1B, and 1C, in my opinion.
And it's going to be hard to say give the ball less to Devontae Smith, A.J. Brown, and Dallas Goedert, but you're right, Gino, because the way that Quez Watkins is going to get those yards is so much different. And, A.J. Brown's a deep threat for sure, and so is Devontae Smith, but it's in a different way, as you said. Like, they're not 100%. Straight line burners where if you're a corner and a safety, you got to be watching 16 all the time. He's not Deshaun Jackson, but he has that similar threat that the Eagles have been so desperate to find for years. And I like
Lou, real quick.
Yeah,
real quick.
Yeah.
In that same regard, they're doing it in a different way than they did a couple years back where they went Jalen Reagor, they went Deshaun Jackson, they went so heavy in terms of one element of creating down the field. You've opened up an entire basket of things and different Easter eggs that all of these different guys can do. Devontae Smith can beat you down the field when it comes to his route running. A.J. Brown can just out-muscle you at the catch point and get through the brackets. Quez Watkins can beat you with straight line speed. They're building a versatile skill set.
Well, wouldn't you agree they could all kind of do the other things too? Like A.J. Brown obviously isn't as fast as Quez Watkins, but he's not slow. And Devontae Smith can out-muscle guys. And Quez had the highest contested catch rate of any receiver on the Eagles last year. So, yeah, you're right. There's a bunch of ways to skin a cat for this Eagles 100%. Receiving core. And again, I'm glad you mentioned returner as well, because that's another thing we should be calling for Quez to do more. He is so fast.
Agreed, man.
Josh Huff and Wendell Smallwood and Chris Polk, there were so many Kenyon Barner, slower players, less explosive, that were able to create production in these spots. Quez Watkins should be able to be a very productive returner for you. And I hope that he can maybe, create that role in 2022. Gino, Quez Watkins is a great one. I think on defense, I think of somebody you really liked in the draft last year, their 3rd round pick at defensive tackle. And there's so many guys in front of him right now that are great that maybe people aren't going to be calling for a role early on because you've got Fletcher Cox ahead of him, Javon Hargrave, and now the 1st round pick they traded up for, Jordan Davis, who a lot of people are going to be saying is the heartbeat of what this defense wants to do. But Milton Williams, I think he's such an athletic freak, and he developed so rapidly down the stretch of the season. I think, and he's going to pair perfectly with what Jordan Davis does. I think he's a perfect complement there to be his Devontae Wyatt, if you would, at Georgia. I think Milton Williams is going to force his way onto the field, man. I know Cox and Hargrave are going to dominate snaps early on, but Milton Williams is going to give this team a reason to maybe consider next year, maybe not bringing back Hargrave or Cox. I mean, Milton Williams is a 99th percentile athlete at this position. And I know Jordan Davis is getting all the hype, as he should, but I'm really excited, and it's ironic because I didn't like the pick when they made him, as you remember. But Milton Williams, I'm excited to see him this year, and I think he's going to be a guy like Josh Sweat a few years ago where you're like, man, he gets to the quarterback.
And I think saying that he's going to be on the field, you have to look at it and say, where is he going to be? He's not just going to be at the 3 tech. They like to put him out wide at that 5 tech position as well. And now that they open up this playbook on the defensive front where they're going to be more versatile, they're going to be more willing to line guys up in odd spots. And you're going to see times when you're going to have a guy like Hassan Riddick mugged up in the A gap, and you could potentially have at nose Jordan Davis, and then on the other side at a 2 tech right over the guard, you could have a big guy like Fletcher Cox or Milton Williams who's just going to disrupt the hell out of all of these offensive lines. And
They're
that's
so
the
deep
thing.
at defensive tackle, man. It's unreal that Milton Williams might be your fourth or just your defensive line in general. You're like eighth, seventh option. It's great.
Yeah, I mean, realistically, is he your Jordan Poole of your defensive line right now? When you look at what Golden State just did, you look at one of the strongest units in the NFL that only has gotten better. We talked about how good that unit was over the last few years. They never reached their potential. They were up and down in terms of coverage and how they were going back and forth. And sometimes the coverage wasn't there on the back end. Sometimes the guys weren't getting there on the front end. Sometimes they didn't have the pieces to run what Jonathan Gannon wanted to run. Now they have all of the horses to run. And Milton Williams, talk about running, man. He is explosive. He's quick. He's long. He's lightning fast with his hands. He's violent, and he's a disruptor. I think when you look at this defensive line, disruption is the number one trait that they're going to look at. Does Jordan Davis disrupt the same way that Milton Williams disrupts? Absolutely not. But they're two guys that are going to disrupt the offensive game plan with the offensive line, with how they break down blocking schemes. I mean, who's going to come in there and double team Jordan Davis and then leave Fletcher Cox potentially, Hassan Riddick, Josh Sweat, and anybody else in a one-on-one situation? And Milton Williams being the fourth or fifth guy, you're probably going to be going against the weaker link when you go in those stunt games with the edge, and when they're looping around or you're going inside and crashing down, they're going to pass you off to probably the weakest link of the offensive line. And Milton Williams is going to be the number two to Jordan Davis for years to come, even if it's without Javon Hargrave, even if it's without Fletcher Cox. They've set themselves up to have that next good pair. They did it for a while with Fletcher, where they were able to bring in guys starting with Benny Logan, for example, and then you go down the line of Timmy Jernigan's and Michael Bennett's. They have just done that now without free agency. They just did it through the draft in the last 2 years, and they have very good players in both of those guys.
I think Tom Donahoe somewhere is shaking his head, but the pick was good. So
we're going to look back on that clip and laugh.
It's ridiculous. Well, especially the guy he wanted. I think he wanted Aaron Robinson, the corner from Florida Atlantic, who was with Jacksonville, wasn't good last year. So it's just funny looking back at that, how much controversy that created. But Gino, I'm excited to see these role players. I think, too, you could look at like Marcus Epps, maybe if Jaquiski Tartt's getting more snaps than him at first, and Epps is as efficient as he was in 2021. Maybe even Kenny Gainwell. There's a bunch of guys. This Eagles team is very deep heading into 2022. Can't wait to see all of them and the roles they are going to start to create in training camp just 3 weeks away from this moment, 21 days until the start of Eagles camp at NovaCare Complex. Until then, though, we're going to continue our What If series, and this is a really fun one that we've never really talked about on this show. We've always talked about, what would have happened if certain big moments in Eagles history went differently. Well, I want to go back to 2018. What happens, and I shouldn't say how it happens, but what happens if regardless of the end of the 2018 run, the Eagles say, we're convinced this Nick Foles magic is going to be consistent. He's our guy moving forward. We're not in denial anymore. And they commit to Nick Foles instead of Carson Wentz. This is a fun hypothetical I want to get into with Gino coming up next. But first, a shout out to one of our sponsors. It's BetOnline, the official sports book of the Locked On Podcast Network. They're your number one source for all your betting needs and sports information. Find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including MLB baseball right now. You've got NBA futures, so much unknown around Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving. The NBA draft just happened too. The NHL draft is coming up. You can bet on it all. MMA, boxing, and golf. Everything at betonline.net. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. They're your continued source for all the scores, podcasts, and news this season, because BetOnline is where the game starts. All right, Eagles fans, welcome into a Tuesday edition of Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast. I'm Louie DiBiase. He's Gino Camilleri, and we're continuing our What If series. So last week we did What If Russell Wilson decided that, hey, I'd come to Philadelphia. I'll waive my no-trade clause in March. How would this offseason have looked different? Would you be more excited, less? What would they have done with all those draft picks? What was left over after the Wilson trade? That's available on all podcast platforms. Then Gino and I discussed a new one, a different one we've never really talked about on the show. What if Deshaun Jackson didn't have that shoelace tackle in 2010 in the wild card round against the Green Bay Packers. Does that 2010 electric offense go on to carry that team to a championship? We got into that. And then, Gino, we're going to discuss now 2018 Philadelphia Eagles football. And the question is simply, what if the Eagles stuck with Foles after that 2018 run? Not the Super Bowl, not Super Bowl 52, but Nick Foles does it again. He goes on another improbable run, maybe even more improbable than 2017, because this was an Eagles team that was 6-7. They were dead in the water coming off a devastating loss at Dallas where they got screwed over by the referees. Their franchise quarterback had a fractured back. He's put on the shelf because they think they don't have a chance at the postseason. And nobody really, I don't know, I think people were done at that point with this season. Nick Foles wills that team into the playoffs with 3 straight wins against the Rams, Texans, and Washington. He gets a playoff win in Chicago, and they're up 14-0 at one point in New Orleans against the top-rated Saints at the Superdome. And I feel like nobody really considered this at the time because everybody was living in the moment just in awe that this was all happening again for the second year. But then you look at, again, Foles hits Golden Tate in the end zone on that 4th and goal, and they beat the Bears. And you're like, okay, I can't believe it happened once, but maybe it's just a mirage. And then you're up 14-0. I think people started to think, like, where is the line here that's drawn? What does Foles have to do where you just can't deny anymore that this is just what he's meant to do in Philadelphia, right? I don't think anything outside of a repeat probably makes the Eagles actually trade Wentz. But regardless of how it happens, like let's say that repeat did happen, I don't know. What happens if they do say Nick Foles is our guy? I mean, what happens in 2019, 2020? Where are we right now? Was that run sustainable? We know he flamed out in Jacksonville and Chicago, but what happens if he stays in Philadelphia? Have you ever thought about that?
I mean, who hasn't, Lou? That
right.
was on Philadelphia and all airways throughout the entire country for nearly a year plus, and that's what most of our podcast took up time talking about. And this time when we revisit it, I'm going to look at it in a completely different light. What happens if they do? Okay, they get 2 Super Bowls in a row. Now you're going,
which would be
can we get
the
3?
most improbable repeat in sports history. Not just football, ever.
Yeah, definitely ever. Then you're saying, okay, we have to ride with this guy. It's like being at a casino. You're putting money on black. Black hits 5 times in a row. You're not going to bet on red until black doesn't hit.
And you feel insane for it because there's no real strategy to it. You just beat the greatest quarterback of all time 2 years in a row to win a championship. This should have not have happened. There's no projection to make sure to feel safe that it's sustainable. But you're right, man. Like, you have to ride with it. You can't not.
It was like when Leicester City won the Premier League.
Right.
It didn't make sense. Nobody could have predicted it. Vegas couldn't predict it.
Their odds were like 6 trillion to 1.
Astronomical. But sometimes in sports, and being the analytic I am and seeing all these arguments about analytics on Twitter, I will always tell you, I am the biggest person when it comes to momentum. And I learned that from Brian Dawkins. Brian Dawkins had a quote years ago. He always used to call it Big Mo. He's like, Big Mo is a real thing. In games, if you watch it, any sport, momentum is huge. Nick Foles would have been the hot hand, right? And we are also 2 years prior to the thing that didn't really crash, but put a little knock on Carson Wentz's value. So let's say they trade him after 2018. You'd have to think they get at least 2 first-round picks, if not more than that.
He was less than a year removed of Gino being the best player in the world. And again, that's why at the time, nobody really disagreed, even after that Foles run in 2018. I think everybody knew because Foles struggled a little bit in the Bears game and the Saints game for sure for most of that football game. I think people knew, like, you still have to ride with Carson. Even in 2018, the ups and downs, he was pretty good with a fractured back for the entirety of the season. I think at the time people understood. But, you know, if the repeat happens, yeah, that changes everything. You could then consider, look, this guy just won us back-to-back championships. Look at the haul we could get for Carson Wentz. I think Carson at that point probably would have forced himself out. Like, I can't live up to this. I need a fresh start. I think that would have happened even if the Eagles kept Wentz. So I think the bigger question is, again, and that is the whole question, if they already in this scenario decide that Foles is the guy, it's what happens after that. Like, what happens in 2019? Because, Gino, every time Foles was committed, every time a team committed to Foles as the guy, he pretty much flamed out. 2014, he struggled after his 27-2 season. 2015 in St. Louis. 2019 in Jacksonville. 2020 with Chicago. He just was an elite closer. He was the Mariano Rivera of football. But I don't know, it makes you think though, because in Philly, it was different. There was something about him in Midnight Green. And it makes you wonder if they had all those picks to build around him, like they did Jalen Hurts right now, does it turn out different?
I'm glad you brought up Jalen Hurts, because if you look at how they're building this team for Jalen Hurts, it's completely different from how they were building it with Carson Wentz. When in fact, I believe, and now looking back on it, that team was probably built better for that window that Nick Foles was in, because they weren't built for the long term. If you look back at it, those moves that they made were 1 to 2 year moves. The Elshon move, they signed him for 1 year. They didn't know what they were going to get beyond that. He signs an extension. You bring in guys like Jay Ajayi. You bring in all of these guys who look at where they are now, Lou. If you were a really long-term projector, and we know Howie Roseman is, somebody who's going to look at the future, you couldn't in your right mind look at that team and say, this team is going to be built for 5 to 6 years.
They were trying to maximize the window. Yeah, I agree.
As much as you and I said we were trying to build said dynasty and we believed it and we were buying into the T, looking back on it now, and it's 2020 vision looking back, of course, but Nick Foles had the lightning in the bottle with a lot of guys who were right at the peak of their peak in their careers, to say, and everything was going right. And beyond that, you're coming off of 2 drafts where you would have had 5 draft picks each going into 18 and 19, right? And you would have had to recoup those. So you're going to have more assets. Then do you set yourself up to say, is Nick our bridge quarterback? Like, do they set themselves up with another guy after that? Like, do they see Nick as only a 1 to 2 year option?
It could have been Justin Herbert in this, because,
right, exactly. That's a very good situation to.
It's kind of similar to what the situation is with Hurts right now. We would have had a bunch of picks from Carson Wentz. You can see if Nick Foles is the guy in 2019. If he's not, you go in on a quarterback in 2020, which I think with the Eagles and what they like would have been Justin Herbert. It wouldn't have been Jalen Hurts. It wouldn't have been Jordan Love. It wouldn't have been Tua.
Boy,
there's a scenario where your boy Justin Herbert is a Philadelphia Eagle, because I guess there's 2 trains of thought with this, Gino. If you're going to put Nick Foles in the exact same scenario as Carson Wentz, where everybody gets hurt in 2019 and they build the exact same way, he's not carrying that team the way Carson did. He just
also had 3 extra picks because you traded
away. And that's the other side of it is, I don't know if in this scenario, the same situation wouldn't have transpired, probably because you could use all those draft picks to build around him in a more sustainable way than they tried with Wentz. So I don't know. It's a super interesting question. I think
what if, brother? That's why we do these.
Yeah. Again, I don't think that Foles would have, even with that roster being really good, I still think he would have had his ups and downs as he always has. And I think eventually they would have moved on. But yeah, I guess it just depends on what the roster looks like to me with Nick Foles, because if it happened the same way in 2019, although every time he's in Midnight Green, things are different than when he's with any other team. And it's so hard. It's such an incredible phenomenon to try to explain. I do think eventually, even in Philadelphia, the longer you gave Foles a chance, the worse it got. Even in 2014, like 2013 to 2014 was the longest that he was the Eagles guy. And you could see him regressing slower and slower. But it makes you think, man, because they would have had a lot more assets to build around him than they had Carson. Today's episode of Locked On Eagles is brought to you by RockAuto.com. With the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you're going to need. Why endure often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning and wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, choosing the only brand that their warehouse happens to carry, when you have computers with access to RockAuto.com at home and in your pocket? Save time and money with Rock Auto. Don't choose to spend 30, 50, even 100% more for the same parts from a chain store or a car dealership. Rock Auto, their prices are reliably low for every customer, and they have everything you could need: brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, and even new carpet. Go explore their easy-to-use website today to find all the solutions to your auto part needs. Gas is so expensive right now. Save some money with your car or truck by choosing Rock Auto. And when you do, make sure you write down Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. Visit rockauto.com today.
I say, fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And I think that's what it would have inevitably been with Nick Foles.
And what a double-edged sword, man. Because again, like you said, even though you know that's probably your future and Carson has a better chance to be your long-term guy, if they repeat, you have to go with Foles.
It's
like you don't.
The roulette analogy is perfect. Like
Can
you
you
have
imagine
to just
Philadelphia if they went with Wentz anyway?
Oh, gosh. I think Howie Roseman would have been dragged out of the NovaCare complex.
Yes,
they would have. For sure. It's one of those realities that there is a reality out there where that happened, but we saw the one where they got us to where we are today. And much to what we are saying, you got picks from Carson Wentz, and you have to say who is going to be the person in charge of them. Do things turn out well for Howie Roseman if that's the case? Does Jeffrey Lurie trust him after he just said and drafted Carson Wentz, and that happens? That's a completely other angle you have to look at this from.
And especially, again, Carson Wentz didn't have a 2020 type of season in 2018. Was it 2017? No. But on a fractured back, Gino, this guy still had, it was 3,000 passing yards, 69.6% completion percentage, 21 passing touchdowns, only 7 interceptions, a 102.2 rating, which was higher than in 2017. He did all of that with a fractured back that I think he suffered. We can never really pinpoint when that happened, but we think it happened that week 4 game against Minnesota. You can never pinpoint it. Yeah, I mean, if he trades that guy away a year removed from the season he had in 2017, what an impossible situation that would have been for Roseman, man. And I mean,
there ain't no coming back from that, Howie. That's for sure.
I think no matter what, though, with the way they were building and the way their mindset was at, because like you said, with the window being open and they were trying to maximize everything, even with all the picks, it's hard to believe that things would have went super different where in 2020 or 2021, they're not looking for a new quarterback. It definitely makes you think, though. I mean, that's one of the biggest what ifs. They were close. I mean, I remember when Jordan Matthews scored that first touchdown, and then they ran in the other one with a QB sneak with Foles, and they're up 14-0 in New Orleans. I was laughing hysterically like a madman. I'm like, I can't.
Jordan Matthews scored the first touchdown.
He scored the first touchdown. For some reason, Marcus Lattimore stopped running. Jordan Matthews down the left sidelines. Foles hits him deep with a guy in his face. Yeah, man, it was Jordan Matthews, number 80 Jordan Matthews.
I forgot they brought him back for that.
Well, because Golden Tate didn't fit so much. They were forcing him on the field, but honestly, they were better most of the time when Jordan Matthews was out there.
What a weird team. What a weird team. I mean, Josh Adams is your leading rusher that year, too. It's what a weird franchise.
Michael Bennett was on that football team.
Why do we cover the weirdest franchise in the world, man? They're so weird. What other team can you look back and say, outside of the New York Giants with Phil Simms and that whole ordeal when it happened, that a backup quarterback takes you to the Super Bowl and you have to talk about this?
And you almost do
we're
it.
Still talking about it. We're doing it 4 years later, still talking about this exact same thing.
I'd kill to just take a look at the universe where this happens. And again, it's kind of like Super Bowl 52. Man. Like, I think in the future that this isn't what's best for this football team. But how can you say no to championships for the long term? Super Bowl 52, if you say Carson Wentz doesn't get hurt, I think maybe it helps things more in the long term. But I would never undo anything that happened that season. That is the greatest first championship you could ever have. It's one of the most improbable, amazing, beautiful sports stories ever. So, yeah, what a beautiful, chaotic team. Gino, before we wrap up, too, I wanted to ask you this question about this topic. Let's say they did commit to Nick Foles post-2018. Or just, looking at that player, who he was coming off that run. And then taking a look at who Jalen Hurts is right now. And regardless of their situations, let's say the rosters are off. You're just picking one of them to start your team with from scratch, and you're building around them. Nick Foles coming off that playoff run or Jalen Hurts right now? Who are you going with?
I would say with the way the league is now, and you're thinking, 2018 is 4 years ago. Man, a lot has changed in the NFL, especially at the quarterback position. I'd be hard-pressed not to choose Jalen right now. The league is going away from guys like Nick Foles. I think that lightning in a bottle, like I said, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. I don't think it was going to happen again. That's why every time and every catch they had to go up 14-0, I was just saying, there's no way. There's absolutely no way, statistically, in any sport, that this is going to happen. I would have loved to see it happen, much like 2017, but it played out the way it did. And now we have to sit back and say, everything that got us here was because of that.
Yeah.
You can't look back and say, let's go with what we had. Much like NFL contracts, you pay guys for what they're going to be. Nick Foles, you were going to pay him for the player that he was.
Right, and you were going to have to in this scenario.
And that's the difference.
Maybe Gino, that's why even if they got all the way to the Super Bowl, they still don't do it. I don't know. You're right, because you're supposed to pay for what they're going to do for you, not what they've done. And I think you're right. I think most people would agree with you. Jalen Hurts is clearly the more consistent player with a higher floor. But knowing me, I'm more of a go for broke kind of person. I don't know if we haven't seen Jalen Hurts.
I can't imagine you at a casino.
No, my gosh, no. That's why I don't gamble much, because I have no discipline at all. He doesn't have yet. At least we haven't seen the Nick Foles goes nuclear kind of gear in him. He doesn't have the disastrous Nick Foles in Jacksonville or St. Louis gear either. But why I would prefer that, and I would have went with Foles, is because if Foles does flame out and I get my answer, I'm going to go get my next guy. Where Jalen Hurts again is that really dangerous middle where you're always afraid, can I do worse? Maybe I should stick with Jalen, but could I do better? You're always kind of wondering. Give me a year and I could probably answer that question better, but super fascinating, man. It's one of the closest moments to complete chaos the Eagles have been in franchise history. It would have been beautiful chaos and I would have welcomed it. Although I was a huge Carson Wentz guy, I can't believe how close they were again. I know that
we root for the logo,
think that,
Lou. We root for the logo.
Oh, absolutely. No, of course. 2018, I was begging Nick Foles to pull that off and win them another championship. Are you kidding me? The bird is what we root for. But yeah, one of my favorite what ifs is really just taking a look at that 2018 season, because there's just so many different ways you could go about it.
Optionality, man. Look at Howie Roseman's tenure. Like, he said that this offseason he had options. I don't think that any other team has had that many options to just go out and say, we have two potential guys that we believe are going to be the quarterback of the future. One of them was a guy who we thought was going to be that player in the first place, then comes back after a little detour and wins us a Super Bowl. The other one we just drafted with a first-round pick.
I'll tell you what, Gino, we would never have guessed that option C would have happened, where neither player was your quarterback in 2022, and Jalen Hurts is the guy. At the time, what was Jalen Hurts doing in 2018? Was he getting benched for Tua, or was that, right? He was taking Alabama to the national title, and Tua was taking over with a freshman Devontae Smith.
Yep.
We would have never guessed that's the guy.
Next year, and then win the SEC championship game going in for Tua, and then he would go to Oklahoma, and then it would lead him here and lead him to a roster where we'll end on this. Lane Johnson was in an interview today, and he said Jalen Hurts demands respect. That's one thing I want my quarterback to have. Whoever is in the building, Lou, regardless if it was Nick, Carson, whatever, Donovan, way back, the quarterback has to be the one that guides that ship. And I haven't said once, as long as Jalen has been there, that he doesn't have the character to lead this boat. And I'm excited,
man. That's the one thing him and Nick Foles had a lot.
21 days away from finding out the potential of this roster. And I'm very, very excited to see how it turns out.
Make sure you guys subscribe to the podcast. We're going to be previewing everything starting next week for Eagles training camp, available in video form as well on YouTube. And we're always talking birds on Twitter. Let us know what you think about these what if scenarios. What happens if the Eagles stick with Nick Foles after 2018? How does the last 3 years look for the Philadelphia Eagles? Hit us up on Twitter at LockedOnBirds, at GC24_football, and at DBLCLOE. Thanks for tuning into the most Italian daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast on all the land. For Gino Camilleri, I'm Lou DiBiase signing off. Thank you so much for making LOE your first listen each and every day. And make sure your second listen is the Locked On NFL podcast, all the news across the league in under 30 minutes. As always, thank you for downloading. Thank you for watching and listening, and let's go Birds.
Fly, Eagles, fly.